restaurants and bars are considered hospitality. Hotels and lodging, event planning can be considered hospitality. Theme parks and tourism. So that all is kind of the careers and services that are situated under hospitality. Um, Within the idea of hospitality, there is this high expectation of being friendly, right? So you probably have heard the phrase like the customer is always right. So there is that, right? So that idea of like being friendly, being and serving, right, people, so that way they have a enjoyable situation. They have an enjoyable experience with whatever they're doing. Um, so this is where the idea of hospitality is situated. We've all interacted within the hospitality industry in some way, whether we have worked in it or we have been, patrons or customers, whatever that might be. We've all interacted within hospitality in some shape or form, most likely. And one of the things that you can kind of think about is like the also kind of cultural norms and values around hospitality, or like what it means to be hospitable, what it means to provide good customer service. Cultural norms really do guide a lot of what good customer service is, because the element here is to make sure that the client or customer again has that enjoyable experience. Um, there is some connections and origins around religious morals and values. We're talking like long-standing historical components around religious morals and values and hospitality. So thinking about it from kind of a longer-standing kind of consideration. The idea of like the religious moral values had a couple of things. The first was controlling strangers' entrance into like the inner space, the inner sphere, right? So like you have your like your inner group, right? Your in group and your out group. Your in group is your smaller community or your smaller society. And then your out group are the folks that aren't there. And so there is this interconnection between kind of the idea of like religious morals and values, of like keeping folks on the outside or protecting entrance into your inner sphere. Um, there was also this overlap because of the idea that like if you do invite people into your inner sphere or into the inner space, you are able to protect the stranger in that space. But then, because of that level of hospitality, it also helps you maintain protection from them. Right? So if you've invited somebody welcomingly, like welcomingly and in a hospitable way, then it helps you kind of gain this like level of trust or protection from them. There was also around a lot of these like ideas of religious morals and values, this kind of idea of hospitality or being hospitable, being about giving basic needs, right? So if somebody needs help with something or support, you're kind of accepting them into the space and giving them some basic needs. But what we understand hospitality to be now is vastly different, especially because of the major shift from industrialization. All right, within this, I like this industrial revolution and change, and then now modernization, we see that there's a giant shift, this big change within what hospitality is, and the shift from it being like about hospitality to the hospitality industry. So there's this major shift now within the industrialization, that we can see as well in our everyday kind of environments. This idea of it being about keeping basic needs is absolutely not right what's happening within the hospitality industry. So the hospitality industry, as we know it, is very different. And when we think about it, we have to kind of conceptualize it both on a global level as well as a national level. Many of us are, in this particular class, I mean, in this space, like in the United States. And the idea of what hospitality looks like is really important, when we're thinking about it in the context of gender. So women make up 53% of the hospitality workforce. So that, even though that may not, it's like that sounds like a somewhat even divide. That does mean also with that divide that there is this gender component for sure. So this is in the United States. So this is in the context of the United States. 61% of women make up the tourism industry, right? So the idea of tourism, travel, and tourist, right? So the industries of tourism. Meanwhile, though we can see that there's a huge number of women who make up this workforce, only 23% of women make up the board of directors on a global level within hospitality and tourism. So even though we see like in the general workforce that women make up 53% in hospitality, 61% in tourism. Globally, though, women only make 23% of the board of directors. And that's a very, very like stark difference, right? Um, as of 2019, with some of the studies that were there in executive level positions, and publicly traded restaurants, so like restaurants that were not small businesses or anything of those, only made up 25% of the executive levels. When you think about other elements of hospitality, 23% make up these executive levels in tourism, 13% in specifically hotels. And then across all of entire leadership, we're looking at 12%. So if you account all the levels, right? So entry level management, directors, partners, owners, board of directors, 12% of the total, even though we see in the overall workforce, it's 53%. There has been an increase. There was an increase from 2015 to 2019, so within those 4 years, that from like a small increase, that it was there was a shift to 17%, by 17% in these like kind of chief, like chief executive officers, and 9% across all leadership. But nonetheless, while that is a nice jump, it's not enough to show equity, any type of real genuine equity within the context of hospitality and tourism, especially if we think about the role of hospitality and tourism on a global scale. Um, a lot of you, not a lot of you, some of you have started working on your ethnographic assignment that's due this weekend, right? And some people that have submitted it have decided to do it in a hospitality space. So, like a coffee shop or a restaurant. So when you're thinking of, if you decide that you're going to go that route or you're going to analyze it, right? These are some numbers that you can actually pull, and any of the readings from this week too, because you can think about what you observe on the ground in that space, but then you might, maybe you see that there's a lot of women in that space, maybe making up that 53%. But what does that mean on a global scale? What does that mean in the executive level? Is that the case for that restaurant or coffee shop? And you don't have to necessarily do all the background research, but just to kind of critically think about that. Within the idea of tourism and hospitality as a whole, there has been this huge shift, in terms of like cultural values and practices too, and the discourse around it. So within this shift, a lot of it has to do with kind of like the origins of tourists. Um, and I think it's also important that we kind of call attention to tourism, um, in the way that we understand. So, like, I'm not saying that we shouldn't travel or that you shouldn't travel, but thinking about kind of the origins of tourism. A lot of the tourists used to be Westerners, and I'm not equating tourism to colonization. Let me make that very, very, very clear. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about more in modern definitions of tourism. Most tourists historically used to be Westerners, so like very white centrist bias in theories and explanations of tourism. So there is sociology of tourism, sociology of hospitality, right? But in terms of like the sociology, like this analysis of it, we have to be aware that the historical origins of tourism and them being Westerners, that means that the research also comes from those tourists and Westerners who were academics and would contribute to those theories. That means that the historical elements are very, very European and white centric, in the explanations on tourism and why. Now, this kind of giant, like global shift and change does push us, though, to have to rethink, this historical theory, as well as question kind of who's been contributing and where is this analysis coming from. So we can see like these global connections, like the globalization. There's entire classes dedicated to it, so we're not going to get into huge amounts of conversations around that right this second. But the global changes that we do see do push us to have to think about this because of how social networking might change, right? So like who's receiving what messages, how do people have access to things differently now because of social network, as well as the global economics. So these trends within social media we see have actually started to shift that discourse, because we can understand like what messages are we receiving and how does this new connection, this new global interconnection, impact how we understand the world and where we're traveling and what we're doing in those spaces. Um, it also has shaped how we're analyzing hospitality and tourism. So, historically, it may have been Westerners who were observing the interactions of tourism and being the tourists, but it also means that we can also question the rationale and reasons for tourism differently. Um, Tourism has played a significant role in this globalization, though, and the connection. So in the 1960s, tourism, the shift in tourism and the changes did impact, for example, railways and technology. So it did like radically increase the number of railways that we saw, as well as the technology. Um, and and one of the biggest things here is that a lot of the emerging scholars they kind of had two schools of thought. One being this idea, so Borson talks about cultural dope, so it's not actually like being engaged with it. It was like pseudo events, so like fake moments of interaction. Meanwhile, there's a lot of positives of tourism that sorry theorists are saying that there's a lot of positives of tourism because of the fact that there used to be this alienation, right? This like kind of this disconnect between people. So the modern tourist who had historically been alienated, McCannell says, is kind of helping with them helping them feel like they have a genuine connection interaction. However, McCannell also is saying though that while there is this big push or need for genuine interaction, right? So basically, in this case, like a lot of this is that there was this big drive for tourism, but this perspective of like people being disconnected and alienated from the larger world is evident. McCannell is saying that there's positives of tourism because historically tourists were alienated. There was this modern tourists were alienated from each other, from the world, right? Thinking about Marx's kind of perspectives of alienation, and they really wanted genuine interaction. But the biggest drawback of that was that it wasn't actually as positive as we would think or hope. Rather, McCannell is saying that because of the nature of hospitality, because of the nature of this interaction of tourism, that it actually is staged authenticity, right? Which is contradictory to authenticity, right? The idea of authenticity being authentic. But McCannell is saying that instead that this is staged authenticity, and that because the emergence of sociology of tourism was not as heavily present yet, that should be the central goal of a sociology of tourism, because we need to be analyzing this staged authenticity under hospitality, especially when we are seeing that so many people are feeling alienated. And if they're engaging in tourism to feel connected, to disrupt that alienation for genuine connection, but they're being met with staged authenticity, that should actually be the central role of a sociology of tourism. That is not what the role of sociology of tourism necessarily is, but in the 1960s and 70s, there becomes this emergence of a sociology of tourism. So, as the field has changed, as it has emerged, even though we see like that 53% and 61% of women being in the workforce, um, it is still a very male-dominated field. And when I say male-dominated field, I don't necessarily mean in terms of on the ground. So it is still very much guided and directed from a patriarchal perspective, first off. And second of all, in terms of the power dynamics and the values associated with it, we have to understand it in terms of being a male dominated field in that way. So, one thing is that we have to recognize that tourism is dependent upon the global interaction, right? So that yes, you can travel, domestically, and you can go to a different state in the U.S., for example. But as a field and tourism as a whole, it is dependent upon the global interactions. And even though that is true, there is still are significant male values that are present inside of the field of hospitality. Um, So one example are like the dynamics of thinking about who is in those executive leadership roles. And if you are in those leadership roles, that means that there's a high rate of nepotism, according to researchers, and that can also impact the type of work culture that is present. Additionally, there's also this idea of an unclear path. So what I mean by that is that even though somebody may want to work their way up, they might want to be engaged with promotions or have this be their career trajectory, because of these power dynamics, because of the level of nepotism, because of this kind of global connection, that there are oftentimes unclear conversations on how somebody could increase their, or like be promoted, or kind of continue on. There's a lot of high staff turnover, and when we're talking about male values, the expectations of, we don't. I don't mean that inherently, like biological essentialism is not what I mean. I don't mean it in terms of the biological elements of it are driving it, but rather like patriarchal elements, patriarchal values. So there's a lot of high staff turnover in the hospitality field. And because of these patriarchal leanings, it also means that family responsibilities are really frowned upon. So the idea of any type of caregiving or family responsibility is frowned upon, which oftentimes impacts a woman's ability to advance in those types of careers. So going back to this unclear career path, the expectations and guidelines are very limited. And then the assumption of caregiving and family responsibilities will oftentimes impact a woman's ability to do different things or advance in her career in the hospitality field. We also see high rates of exploitation, labor exploitation, across the different types of hospitality. And that exploitation also looks a lot like recruitment of female workers for entry level positions without these clear pathways, without the advancement because of those family obligations and caregiving. So looking at it from like a conflict theorist perspective, even we can see how like there's this inherent kind of power differential, but then symbolic interactions can say that it's the meanings that we've associated with these things, right? So understanding how this male dominated field in terms of power dynamics play a role in it is really important. We see a lot of occupational segregation, gendered occupational segregation in hospitality. And we can see that like this recruitment of female workers, for example, that gendered segregation, in the UK, 60% of the total workforce are women or female workers, and 70% worldwide. So we're talking about total workforce, including in Southeast Asian countries. And that's some of the data that has come out as well. And that, including the Southeast Asian countries, was relevant because of the study that the UK that the study came from. And that segregation is very clear. So it talks about both horizontal, so even in the same positions, there's a lot of gendered segregation, and the distribution of work, as well as up and down, so like climbing that ladder. So oftentimes women remain at lower levels, and the types of work that's done in the same position is very segregated. So when we're looking at I'll go into this in a minute, but when you're looking at, for example, if you decided to do a hospitality observation for your ethnographic observation that's due this weekend, that might be something that you would look at, right? So highlighting the different types of jobs that people do, even if they are in the same position. And that's a crucial consideration for gendered segregation or gendered occupation segregation in the context of the hospitality industry. So gender diversity is something that we have to kind of look at in terms of the research on why diversity is important. So, we can see that based off the numbers a couple of slides ago, that diversity is not all there. But there has been a lot of research that shows why diversity is important. So the first thing is that some studies have highlighted that more diversity across genders in different roles, including the higher levels, will have increased performance and performance of an entire like company and organization. So this gender diversity helps increase performance of the organization. There's also some studies that have highlighted that, or like specifically lobby that says that female CEOs are better equipped to lead female workers. So that's not necessarily saying inherently, right? Like that it's a natural thing, but rather if you are a woman who has been in these situations, then you are more equipped to have those conversations. And because the hospitality field is over 50% women, it would make sense then if you had female CEOs who are better equipped to lead female workers because they've had to navigate that. So we have talked about, I think I've talked about the glass cliff. And this idea in hospitality, there's a couple of concepts too that we can see why diversity is so important. So the first is this idea of like the broken rung, which is that, even as women enter the management positions, they are often kind of neglected. So even if they manage to get to that management role, they are often neglected at that point. So if they climb that ladder or they go up, they're trying to get there, they hit that glass ceiling. So it's like an invisible glass ceiling. And that glass ceiling has a lot to do with gender equity. So the proverbial glass ceiling basically is there. And this idea of the broken rung is that sometimes you'll hit that glass ceiling or you'll miss that first step of the ladder of leadership. So if you're thinking about like visually seeing a ladder, that you might be climbing that ladder, but you'll hit that first step. And the broken rung basically is when you when you miss that first step or you miss the different stages in that process, you might hit a glass ceiling because it limits your training and background. So that is one concept that we see, that even if diversity is centered, it's kind of like an abandonment or a negligent thing, right? So the people that are involved, the women that are involved, like, great, cool, you're getting promoted, but not being provided ample support or training. For every 100 men promoted to an entry level management position, like actually promoted, only 72 women for every 100 are actually even given the same opportunity, not necessarily even promoted or being put on a huge trajectory, but rather just given that same opportunity. And then fewer women are in junior management positions, which in turn means that if there are fewer in junior management positions, there will be fewer that will be able to be promoted to those executive positions. And this goes back to this idea of like, the necessity for gender diversity, that we can see that if there's high staff turnover, which is what some of the studies had highlighted, right, and some of those patriarchal values that are present, it then further highlights and necessitates why gender diversity should be central, right, to some of this conversation. Thinking about like conceptual and theoretical, we can analyze this from our foundational theories, right? Like the three major umbrella theories that we have in sociology. But because the sociology of tourism is a relatively newer field, I don't mean like new, right? The 70s isn't that new, but at the same time, it is in the sense that like the history of it, and tourism is constantly changing. But we have to kind of consider some of these like concepts. So the first is that from the study, Compostoria says that women are often employed in roles of waitresses, receptionists, and housekeeping staff, seen as an extension of their domestic role. The idea of, so the industry of hospitality and tourism are reliant upon low skilled, and I use that loosely and I'll explain why, and low paid service jobs. I don't like the idea of some skills not being like important skills, underskilled, no skilled, low skilled, because I have to tell you from experience, it is a heck of a skill to maintain a smile and not lose it on somebody who is completely treating you terribly in the customer service field, right? So this idea of like what is valued as a low skill, what is no skill, what are high skill jobs, is very dependent upon our capitalistic economic structure of productivity. But the idea is that the industry is reliant upon low paid jobs, low paid service jobs, and in turn have kind of framed it this way as needing low skilled people. The idea, so one study from 2006 highlighted that women are attracted to such working conditions because they can be domesticated as an arranged into the family friendly kind of sphere. But there's a couple problems with that. The first is that that is assuming that it can be arranged in that way. Additionally, it's also under the categorization of it only being part time. So the idea that it can be a part time position instead. Again, the biggest problem with that is that that is still also dominated by the idea that somebody may only be able to survive on a part time job. Um, and this idea of like horizontal segregation and vertical segregation as a theory, or like not a theory in itself, but like a conceptual idea, is important because we talk about them as separated from each other, right? So the horizontal segregation, going back to um, this one here. So the idea of the horizontal segregation being that you might be in the same position or the same level, but you have vastly different jobs. And then the vertical segregation being that some people, like that as you get higher up, that women are not in those positions, they become fewer and fewer. There is this like assumption that they are separated from each other. They can't be associated with each other. But we can see that those are a part of a structural cultural problem. And it also reinforces gender stereotypes. Um, so when we're thinking about the whys and we're questioning our own biases too in how we interact with people, why we interact with them, if you've ever had to talk to a manager or you've ever had to talk to, like, even as an employee or not, or you've had to interact with somebody in a different sphere, why or how can we, kind of use our biases in a way to analyze the structure? So this one here, I think is this quote here. I really kind of want us to continue with that.
I want to talk a little bit more about some of the different perspectives and thoughts around sex work. As a reminder, right, social theories, the role of that is to explain social phenomenon, and to also explain kind of like the underpinnings, philosophies, et cetera, around it. And so when we're looking at the different thoughts around sex work, there's a wide range of it, as I mentioned before. There is these kind of Marxist and radical feminist perspectives. So not to be confused with like, a like Marxist critique of the economic structure per se, but rather the way that radical feminism, so like radical in itself isn't always an inherently problematic word, but radical feminism is a very different kind of philosophy in it. And so this kind of interconnection of Marxism and radical feminism has a lot of those neo-abolitionist perspectives that I talked about on Tuesday. So because of the origins, right, of the economic structure and system, this perspective does look at how sex work is a form essentially of sexual exploitation because of how our economic structure is designed, right? So our economic structure of capitalism in itself, where you have the capitalists who are the owners of the means of production, and then you have your working class who are constantly, having to work and are receiving high levels of exploitation. So looking at the economic structure is a crucial component of this perspective of Marxism and radical feminism. And the reason is that sex work will impact women more often than not. And then that the patriarchy, negatively impacts and disproportionately impacts women and girls. So the analysis comes from that social organization because of the fact that there's this interconnection from this perspective of sex work and sexism, because the role of sexism is to uphold that male privilege. Sex work then under an economic structure that is intricately connected to patriarchy is what the kind of origins of this are. The idea that sexual exploitation and sex work is in turn sexual exploitation. Radical feminists also are looking at this because of the fact that there is a high level of violence against women, and that it is right. It's due to institutional and structural sexism. The idea of control and power over women and women's, bodily autonomy. And so Marxism and radical feminists are looking at this interconnection of it, which is one of the arguments around sex work, or like, kind of essentially against sex work, or against sex work to the extent that some of the more sex positivism looks at. Um, looks at the government and society as the social context, right? So being able to contextualize how our society might weaponize certain things against women, and that interconnection between social and cultural norms as well as the government power, government system, right? Because the idea is that Marxism is looking at that kind of role of the state in this, and radical feminism is looking at how the government can uphold these levels of oppression and exploitation. And because of the fact that social norms and the government can uphold this patriarchal perspective, this social organization, that is one of the arguments against sex work because of the level of exploitation. Um, One of the other things too is that there's this kind of like acceptance of the hierarchy. And I see the comment. I'll look at that in a minute. And how this acceptance also tends to exclude women from the decisions. So even if we're thinking about the way that sex work might take place, because of the interconnection of the government and social settings, that theoretical understanding can in turn um, just continue to perpetuate the patriarchy because women oftentimes are not included in those decisions. That is a really great question. So just to kind of address what you said in the chat, just and making sure that we highlight that trafficking is not sex work, right? But I understand what the context of your comment is. Um, so I think that that's complicated because of these different theoretical perspectives. I could definitely look into that because I look more at like kind of the theoretical elements of this, and then obviously some of the empirical since we've been looking at empirical studies. Um, I think that one of the biggest struggles with that though is how people will say that they choose it, right? So like they choose it as a career, but then there's the argument that we all technically will choose careers based off of financial needs or remain in them. So I don't know what those statistics might look like. But I can look, I think that's an interesting question. And I can look to see like, if there's anything that is explicit with that, as opposed to kind of exploring the experiences, which is where a lot of our empirical studies have come from. Um, yeah. Okay, so and that's actually something that's interesting when you pose that question here in the chat too, thinking about this idea of like the respect around jobs. So if you have like access to higher paying positions, the question then from a Marxist and radical feminist perspective is is it a matter of choosing because it's something you want to do, or is it a matter of choosing because of the economic structure? And that's one of the questions that this theoretical perspective is kind of looking at is the kind of male-centered perspectives within work, with what we value or highlight as a society as being valuable, and then how access to different types of pay might influence the decisions that people make. All right, so thinking about this as well, so continuing on with that, this idea is that sex work looks at the like looking at it as sexual commerce. So even if somebody, theoretically, from this perspective, um, even if there is this idea that somebody might choose, there's still, from this Marxist and radical feminist perspective, a harmful element to that because it has a lot to do with the patriarchal right of access to women's bodies and then the male gaze. So, because even if women might choose, which might choose this path, right? The argument from this perspective is then, is it by choice? And if it is it actually just still upholding the patriarchy? From this perspective, it's because it perpetuates that subordination to men. But then, of course, other theoretical like sex positivism will say, well, it's kind of reclaiming one's body, reclaiming one's position in society to be able to push against that. I mean, I don't disagree with you, being able to like embrace one or the other. I also think that sometimes we feel compelled to have to embrace one or the other, when I think it's really nuanced, especially if we think about it from a global perspective. Right. If we're thinking about it from a global perspective and the intersectional perspectives with that, I think that I think it's actually harmful for us to say that we might embrace one or the other only without looking at those nuances. And the statistics could definitely be helpful as well. So I appreciate that. Like I said, I'm more than willing to look up to see what kind of, maybe quantitative studies have existed out there if it has to do with that, because of that. But I do think that the nuances of like, intersectionality and global perspectives, as well as just personal perspectives on that would be um, hard to do a deep analysis of it, like a theoretical analysis too of empirical data, because of the fact that I I think it's a spectrum, and I think it depends on a lot of factors. And I don't think that it's as easy as doing only one or the other because of all of those nuances within our human existence. But I appreciate your reflections on this because those are the questions and reflections that we should be having instead of just kind of clinging on to one singular kind of perspective just wholeheartedly. Um, Yeah, and so and I think that those questions are good because like even this like theory here, right, we could see how maybe some groups of folks this theory might be harmful or damaging to them. But then also how this might have some sort of weight to different groups, right? Might have some sort of like genuine theoretical explanation too for some people. So and how, right, on a global perspective there might be continued exploitation because of this perspective. And I think it depends, right? Theory is useful to explain social phenomenon, but not always will it explain every experience either. Um, and so within that here, right, like the idea of economic dependence on men in a male-centric society, it is a male-centric society, but we can see that it differs across different groups and different countries and different locations regionally and globally. And so we have to kind of ask those questions and look at that from this perspective as well. One of our overarching theme is that of capitalism, and then in turn oppression, right? Because of capitalism, it will continue to perpetuate that exploitation of women within this economic structure. So it's the intersection of class and sex, essentially. So that the one of the overarching questions they have is it actually voluntary? One of the things that is a big criticism of this perspective is that it does sometimes create an unhelpful narrative. Not saying that there isn't maybe some sort of application of it in certain settings, of course, because we do know that our economic structure, excuse me, is exploitative in many ways. But the biggest criticism is that it has it focuses a lot on sex work as we're defining it, rather than a genuine separation of sex trafficking and sex work, which is unhelpful, even if we're trying to ask some of those questions that were asked in the chat, or even just kind of critically reflecting. It is unhelpful because if so long as we're combining the two, it then blurs those experiences and does a lot of harm on both sides. This pro-sex work perspective, kind of going back to it, is very sex positive. So the idea is it splits from feminist schools of thought, like historical feminist thoughts. One of the biggest reasons is that it's an advocate, like it's an they are advocates for sex work, for women's rights and sex work, because the idea is that it is an autonomous choice of sex work. And the big reason is that sexuality is a very personal experience, and that idea of who to be involved with intimately, what we're going to engage in should be left up to the woman, and that any type of dictation is wrong, dangerous, and patriarchal. And um and as you were saying, like your Hugh, even like in the chat, how like the hesitation, I think like looking at this as like a spectrum rather than having to be boxed into one or the other, I think is probably one of the best routes to go, because it's not that easy, right? It doesn't necessarily apply to every single situation. um and then, like, one of the other thoughts that we talked about in this class is this idea of intersectionality, right? So intersectionality should be at the core and the forefront of everything we're doing. An intersectional perspective is looking at the different connections of identities within class, gender, race, and sexuality, as well as anywhere else, right? You could think about like religion and language, as well as like geographic region, and global location, disability, etc. And so intersectionally does ask the question on like who is protecting who and why, right? So who's being defined as a victim, who's being defined as a criminal, who's being defined as empowered, right? So it asks the questions of what the appropriateness of that. Because it's not enough to just simply look at the interconnection of gender and sex or gender and sex work. Even the questions in the chat highlight that, right? We have to understand the different global perspectives, how culture, race, class, all of these factors can play a role in the oppression and exploitation, as well as like the policies and laws around it, and why we wouldn't be advocates for different groups. And when I say advocates, I don't mean in a savioristic way, but in like a policy way, a structural way. One of the biggest criticisms of this particular one is that it's a lack of empirical validity, but there's enough evidence out there that does go to show, right, that policies and practices, depending on geographic region or location or all of these social locations and identities, will play a role in how people would navigate sex work and perceive it. But this idea of empirical validity is rooted a lot in very clear, explicit explanations of variables, and that's kind of what they're looking at. But there is still enough qualitative data out there that would exist as empirically valid. Um, sorry, I just want to see what else we have to do. Okay. So going into this political economy perspective, the political economy perspective does have a lot of overlap with the Marxist feminism. But it's a little different because we're looking at the political economy, not just like the economic structure. So the political economy perspective was originally looking at intimate partner violence specifically. So that was and like gendered analysis of that intimate partner violence. But the thing with it is that they're looking at the interconnection between the state and the economy, and there is that shared understanding. So when they're looking at that, they're looking at how the state can either uphold or challenge the welfare, and then what the political process is around things as it relates to violence against women. Some states, and the reason why this political economic perspective is a little different is that the Marxist feminist perspective, right, is just kind of an overarching idea. But the political economy one is understanding that different political processes might either encourage or exacerbate women's experiences. So we can think about even in the United States, right, different states have different policies around reproductive health. So in that case, we're looking at the interconnection between the economic structure and the political process and how that either can uphold or exacerbate women's experiences, and what might influence their choices. So what, for example, somebody who might be dependent upon cash or need immediate assistance, their economic welfare is directly tied to to the state, right, within this political process. This focuses more on like the wealth, though, not just the systemic oppression. So even there is still an intersectionality in terms of sexual violence and exploitation, it's not necessarily looking at oppression. It's looking more at the political economic structure around wealth, and looking at also not just material wealth, but cultural and social capital too. So cultural and social capital has a lot to do with right, the way that navigate how you navigate systems, what types of cultural norms you learn, which norms hold more value in society, and from the political economic perspective is looking at how there may be fewer options for survival, and why or how that might encourage or discourage the engagement in sex work. Okay, so we talked a little bit about criminalization and legalization. So we know that criminalization at this point, right, is when you're making things a criminal act or criminal behavior. A lot of different global areas, as well as parts of Nevada, do face these two different elements here. So decriminalization removes criminal penalties. So for example, or some element of criminal penalties. So Sweden, for example, is that people who are sex workers are decriminalized. So if you sell some sort of sex service, it's decriminalized, but The buyers of sex are not. So there is still a criminal penalty for those who are purchasing sex services or are, buying sex services, but those who are sex workers, there is a decriminalization. Meanwhile, New Zealand, for example, all acts of sex work are decriminalized. So we can see that even the decriminalization is not as simple as, oh, there's no more criminal acts or no criminal penalties anymore. It's not that simple. It's not like, in this binary of it is or it isn't. It depends on where you're at. Legalization is a far more controversial component. So New Zealand, even though all acts are decriminalized, New Zealand is a big advocate for legalization. The Netherlands have a lot of legalization elements, like parts of Australia and others. And the biggest difference between them is that, like, the decriminalization, there are no criminal penalties for it, depending on which part of it, right? So look, going back to this idea of New Zealand. But legalization allows for regulation and taxation. So thinking about how the legalization of it might actually contribute to national economies, how labor standards might be in place, right? So it helps reduce like levels of labor exploitation. It helps reduce violence, as well as several empirical studies have highlighted that it also reduces the rates of, PTSD, mental health, other mental health, like just general mental health conditions, as well as STDs, and other sex-related health conditions that might come up. So some studies have highlighted how legalization can help contribute to that. And the biggest thing with legalization is that it is more controversial from an ethical perspective or moralistic perspective. But it does help with the regulation, taxation, as well as the lack of labor exploitation, and then reductions of different health conditions. Okay, I'm going to finish up with this, and then I'm going to actually hand over to our next group. And then we'll probably finish just a little early because I know that a lot of folks are probably feeling, are feeling it this week. So we'll see what we do and how far we get today, with timing. So these are micro theories. A lot of the theories that I was talking about before were macro theories, right? So looking at the larger structure and systems, like the larger picture, while these are more micro theories. Now, micro theories tend to be looking at a lot of the like victimization and rationale for entry into it. So the macro theories are looking at the, again, larger economic structure, looking at the larger processes of oppression, etc. But the micro theories are looking more at the lived experiences and the rationale why. So the life course theory, for example, is looking at the interaction between sex work and like lived experiences. So like what have you been introduced to throughout your life, and how did different life stages influence or impact engagement in sex work? So a lot of this life course theory looks at how people who are entering the field of sex work maybe were impacted by harmful social control processes during their childhood, and that this is a lot of it, that it's called initial entrapment, and that it's a desire for acceptance and love. So again, it's a micro level theory that is very common in the analysis of sex work. So life course theory. So how is your life course essentially, how has one's life influenced entry into sex work or not, and that there's this desire for love and acceptance, which is called the initial entrapment. um and and so with that, we have a couple other theories too. So one is the theory of social control. So with the theory of social control is that it has a lot to do with how youth are connected to conventional society. So what is the bond? What is the connection to it? We see a lot of overlap with this theory of social control with like arguments around like substance abuse as well, because it has a lot to do with like deviant behavior or delinquent behavior, deviant being anything that just violates social norms. And um so Guad says that basically under this theory of social control, that a lack of solid foundation or bonds to conventional society in youth will influence and increase the risk of deviant behavior, including that of sex work. Meanwhile, social learning model is looking at the victimization. So even though the other two are looking at the entry into sex work, social learning model is looking more at the how individuals that are sex workers are victimized oftentimes within, like, because a lot of times there's like a high rate of being unhoused within this community. Again, think about 1993, so this is a while back. And looking at the connection also between family backgrounds and deviant survival strategies. So looking at how perhaps deviant behavior is a survival tactic because of the type of childhood that you have. And then structural choice theory is looking at how different routines that we engage in and different lifestyles we have might impact the risk or lack of a victimization. And in turn, that sex work has a lot to do with survival. Now, one of the biggest criticisms I have, and actually I think this can go back to the question too around like statistics and studies, is that a lot of the micro theories these days, not these days, but a lot of the micro theories are heavily rooted in looking at sex work as victimization, looking at sex work as some sort of horribly deviant act to engage in, and that we need to figure out the psychological processes why somebody has done this and what type of messed up childhood must they have. And there is a lot to be said about a need for further micro theories to be developed that maybe are a little more positive, or even just kind of like, I don't like the word neutral, but like, just generally explanatory, that could incorporate and include more of the, studies on choices, rationale, and like, personal decisions that maybe aren't always rooted in some sort of psychological factor of, abuse and exploitation.